Last summer, my friends and I decided to make the most of our break before senior year by planning a camping trip to the old quarry on the edge of town. It was the perfect spot, far enough away to feel like an adventure, but close enough that our parents wouldn't freak out. We packed our tents, sleeping bags, and enough junk food to last a week and headed out on a hike to the quarry. There were 5 of us: Jake, Emily, Sam, Lily, and me. We were all excited, joking around as we hiked. The place had a reputation for being creepy at night, but we laughed it off, eager for a fun week away from everything. The first day was perfect. We set up camp, swam in the quarry, and roasted marshmallows as the sun set. But as the night fell, things started to get weird. It began with strange, distant sounds that echoed through the trees. At first, we thought it was just animals, but the noises didn't sound quite right. Around midnight, while we were sitting around the campfire, we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. We shone our flashlights into the woods, but there was nothing there. We tried to brush it off, but the mood had definitely shifted. It felt like we were being watched. The next day, we decided to explore the quarry. It was huge, with steep, rocky walls and deep, clear water. We spent the afternoon diving off the cliffs and lounging by the water, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. But as we were heading back to camp, we found something strange. A small makeshift shelter hidden among the trees. It looked like someone had been living there recently. We didn't know what to make of it, but Jake, always the bravest, or maybe just the most reckless, decided to check it out. Inside, he found a few old blankets, some empty cans, and a notebook. He brought the notebook back to camp, and we all gathered around to see what was inside. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, but we managed to piece together that it belonged to someone who had been living out here for weeks. They were rambling about keeping watch and protecting the quarry. That night, none of us could sleep. We kept hearing those footsteps, now more frequent and closer than before. Around 2 a.m., there was a rustling right outside our tents. My heart was pounding as I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight into the darkness. Standing there, just outside the circle of light, was a man. He looked disheveled with wild eyes and clothes that seemed to be unwashed for weeks. He stood there, staring at us without saying a word. Then, without a sound, he turned and disappeared into the woods. We packed up our camp in record time, deciding it was time to leave. As we hiked back to town, we couldn't shake the feeling that he was following us, watching from the shadows. When we finally reached town, we went straight to the police. They took our statements and promised to check out the quarry. A few days later, we heard that they found the man's shelter, but there was no sign of him. They assured us that it was probably just a drifter passing through. Even now, I can't get those nights out of my head. The feeling of being watched, the strange noises, and the man's wild eyes. We never went back to the quarry, and every time I think about camping, I remember that summer and the sense of dread that hung over us. What was supposed to be a fun adventure turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. Last summer, I landed a gig as a lifeguard at the local pool. It was supposed to be a chill job, spend my days in the sun, make some money, and hang out with friends. The pool was a popular spot, especially with kids and families. But there were always those few hours in the late afternoon when it got really quiet. That's when things started to get weird. One day, during one of those quiet hours, I noticed a guy hanging around at the edge of the pool area. He wasn't swimming or even dressed to swim, just standing there, watching. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for someone, but he didn't move, just stood there, staring. His presence felt off, like he didn't belong. I tried to shrug it off and focus on my job, but the next day, he was back. Same spot, same creepy stare. I mentioned it to my friend Mike, who worked at the concession stand. Mike joked about it, saying the guy was probably just some harmless weirdo. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I stayed late to help clean up after a big swim meet. It was getting dark and everyone had left except for me and a couple of other staff members. As I was finishing up, I saw the guy again, standing by the fence this time, just outside the pool area. My heart raced as I watched him. He was closer now, and there was something menacing in the way he stared at me. I quickly grabbed my stuff and left, trying to act casual. I didn't want to let on that he was freaking me out, but inside I was terrified. I made it to my car and drove home, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure I wasn't being followed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump. I kept thinking about that guy and his creepy stare. The next day at work, I was on edge, scanning the pool area for any sign of him, but he didn't show up. I started relaxing, thinking maybe he had finally moved on. But then, just as I was closing up, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It read, "Find me." My blood ran cold. I looked around, but the parking lot was empty. I stuffed the note in my pocket and got out of there as fast as I could. I told Mike and a couple of other coworkers about the note, and they agreed it was seriously creepy. We decided to report it to our manager, who called the police. They took a report but didn't seem too concerned. They said they keep an eye on the place and left it at that. A few nights later, I was home alone. My parents were out of town, and my sister was at a friend's house. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, trying to distract myself from the creepy guy at the pool, when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone was walking around the side of the house. I muted the TV and listened. There it was again, footsteps crunching on the gravel path. I grabbed my phone and called Mike, whispering to him about the noises. He told me to stay on the line and check it out. I crept to the window and peeked outside. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I caught a glimpse of movement near the back door. My heart was pounding as I tiptoed to the kitchen. I looked out the back door and saw him, the creepy guy from the pool. He was standing in my backyard, staring right at me. My blood ran cold, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. Mike was shouting through the phone, asking me what was happening. I told him the guy was in my backyard, and he said he was calling the cops. I backed away from the window, trying to stay out of sight, but I tripped over a chair and made a loud noise. The guy heard it and started moving toward the house. Panic set in, and I ran to the front door, throwing it open and sprinting outside. I could hear the guy behind me, his footsteps getting closer. I didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's house, pounding on their door and screaming for help. The police arrived a few minutes later, but the guy was gone. They searched the area but didn't find any sign of him. They told me to stay with a friend or family member for the night, and they'd keep an eye on my house. The next day, my parents came home and I told them everything. They were freaked out and insisted on changing our home security. I never saw the creepy guy again, but for the rest of the summer, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The pool, which was supposed to be my chill summer job, had turned into a place of dread. I quit and spent the rest of the break trying to forget the whole terrifying experience. As weeks passed, my life slowly returned to normal. That was until one day, while I was scrolling through old news articles for a school project, I stumbled upon a headline. Local man, missing for years, found dead near community pool. My heart raced as I read the details. The man had gone missing years ago, and his body was discovered buried near the pool where I had worked. The photo of the man sent chills down my spine. It was the same guy who had been watching me all summer. Realization hit me hard. The creepy guy wasn't just some weirdo. He was a ghost trying to get someone to find his body so he could rest in peace. I had unknowingly been part of his desperate attempt to be found. To this day, I wonder if he finally found peace or if he's still out there, waiting for someone else to uncover his story. One hot summer, I decided to take a job mowing lawns around the neighborhood. It was a good way to make some cash and stay in shape. One of my regular clients, Mrs. Thompson, had the biggest yard on the block. Her house was a huge, old Victorian that looked a bit out of place among the more modern homes. I arrived at her place early one morning. The sun was already blazing and I wanted to finish before it got too hot. As I started mowing, I noticed something odd. There was an old shed in the back corner of her yard that I hadn't paid much attention to before. Today though, I saw that the door was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me, so during my break, I decided to check it out. The shed was full of old gardening tools, broken furniture, and dusty boxes. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been opened in years. As I was about to leave, I saw something strange. An old weathered journal half buried under a pile of rags. I flipped it open and started reading. The entries were dated back to the 1970s. They were written by a teenager named Sam, who used to live in the house. The journal detailed how Sam felt uneasy in the house, especially in the backyard. He wrote about a man he often saw lurking around, always watching him. The last few entries were particularly disturbing, talking about how the man got closer and closer each day. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the final entry. It was dated July 15, 1978. Sam wrote that he was going to confront the man and get some answers. That was the last entry. There were no more pages after that. Feeling spooked, I put the journal back and finished mowing as quickly as I could. I wanted to ask Mrs. Thompson about the journal, but she wasn't home. I decided to leave it for another day. That night, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling from reading Sam's journal. I decided to do some digging. I looked up old newspaper archives online and found an article about a missing boy named Sam from the late 70s. He was never found. The next time I mowed Mrs. Thompson's lawn, I worked up the courage to ask her about Sam. Her face went pale when I mentioned his name. She told me that Sam was her younger brother and that he disappeared without a trace one summer. The family eventually moved on, but the mystery of his disappearance haunted them. I showed her the journal I found in the shed. She was stunned and took it from me with trembling hands. She thanked me and said she would show it to the rest of her family. After that day, I couldn't bring myself to go back to Mrs. Thompson's house. I passed the job on to another friend and hoped to forget about the whole thing. But every now and then, I found myself thinking about Sam and the man he wrote about. I wonder if Sam confronted him that night and what really happened in that backyard so many years ago.